In insurance, you are trying to pretty much insure anything that's like part of GDP. Any goods, any services in some way is going to be touched. Every time I see some kind of like new thing happening, I'm like, ugh, this is something where the insurance industry in the short term can lose money, but on the other hand, it's a new opportunity. That's one of the good things about insurance. It can improve risk management, and honestly, it can also be an early warning signal. A lot of insurance products were developed a long time ago, and the insurance industry tends to be rather product focused. So here's the product and you should buy it, and if you don't, you're an idiot. In reality, a lot of those insurance policies don't really reflect how people's lives are now. Some of the policies didn't really cover the issues that women were facing.
What's a key trend you've identified recently that companies aren't paying enough attention to yet?
What is your biggest focus to be able to predict where things might go?
Well,
to begin with, maybe we could start with your background. You have a pretty substantial background navigating from arts graduate to accountant, auditor, equity analyst, strategist, advisor, and board member. How do you connect the dots looking backward? And did this perhaps unconventional path shape your approach to leadership today?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm one of these people that I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was a child. And I flip-flop between all sorts of different really random jobs, from working in the post office to wanting to be the foreign secretary, even though I had absolutely no idea what that involved. And by the way, that's Secretary of State for anybody who's listening in the US. So I really had no idea. And I did a history degree because it was my favorite subject at school, and it was also the one I was best at. So I thought I had the most chance of getting into Oxford, which is absolutely what I wanted to do. And I have to admit that once I did that, I was 17, I'd got into Oxford, and or maybe 18. And then I'm like, I have no idea what I want to do, but never mind, I'll do my degree and I'll figure it out. But the problem was, as I was doing my degree, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do. But it was around the time of Big Bang. And even though I wasn't a finance person at all at the time, and I'd actually stopped doing maths at school when I was 15, I was kind of attracted to that. There seemed to be a lot of energy. There were a lot of regulatory reforms, seemed like kind of good opportunities. And so that's what made me really want to work in financial services. And at the time, and it seems like this is a recurring theme for those of us who've been around for a while, but the markets were really bad. Probably remember 1987 in the UK, there was a huge hurricane, and actually the stock market couldn't even open because all the electricity lines were down and so on. But it was also a very bad time for the financial market. And so instead of going to work for an investment bank or something like that, where there were hardly any jobs and they were very insecure, I decided to follow what one of my best friends in college was doing and go and work for an accountancy firm and get qualifications as an accountant. That was, with hindsight, a very sensible thing to do, because by the time I qualified, the economy was much better, and also it is a very credible qualification. That led me into, I guess, what is the thread through my career to a certain extent, which was things to do with insurance, because I asked to be in a financial services team, and they allocated me to a group that was doing insurance audits, principally around the Lloyd's of London market, and actually in an office, in a very old area of the city, close to Tower Bridge. So by chance, I then started working in insurance, and pretty much kind of everything I've done has some link to that one way or another.
You've done business in over 55 countries and served roles globally. How did this global perspective shape your insights into trends in finance and insurance?
Yeah, I've been to 55 or more countries. I'm not sure I've done business in absolutely all of them, but I've done business in most of them. And I'm actually somebody who's really fascinated by the different ways in which business is done in different countries. And I know that you spent a lot of time in Japan, and doing business in Japan, from my limited experience, is very different from doing business in the UK or the US or Italy or South Africa or wherever it is. And I was thinking about this earlier on today, because my family actually didn't travel very much. we went on holiday in the UK. We had what are called bucket and spade holidays on the beach in Devon. And then went off doing all sorts of things with our ponies and stuff when we were kids. So, I'd been to France and countries like that, but I hadn't traveled a lot. And so it was really when I started working and when I got into my second job that I started traveling, because I had a job that was global, kind of ex-UK and US, pretty much. So it was the beginning of the Bermuda insurance market. And I was doing counterparty credit analysis. We were looking at companies in countries like Poland and Hungary and so on. So a lot of these countries that were kind of emerging from having been behind the Iron Curtain, and the companies were not rated by the rating agencies because they thought they didn't have enough data. They were too new. So that was pretty interesting. So I've always been fascinated by, as I say, the way different countries do business. On the other hand, I've been frustrated to a certain extent about the insurance industry, because the truth is it's really a global business, because for huge risks, you need that amount of capital and capacity, and you need the diversification. And some of the regulations make that harder. I think it's examples. Well, in the US, it's an example between state and federal, right? Which we have for so many things. And globally, it's an example of kind of trying to protect local companies and the local economy, but it doesn't actually necessarily generate the best outcomes. For example, in Africa, in a lot of countries, you have to give business to a local reinsurance company. But one of the risks there is, first of all, they might not have the expertise. Secondly, they can't really diversify because they're not in the position to write massive kind of international risks. And the other thing is that in some cases, all the companies are kind of sharing risks amongst each other. And so potentially you can get this kind of spiral effect, like a pass the parcel of risks, which happened in Lloyd's of London a few decades ago, and it was pretty bad. So that there, unfortunately, when you look at kind of regulation in the insurance industry in a global context, it could be improved a lot. And I think there are a lot of kind of historical anomalies that really need to be got rid of.
So, out of interest, over time, have the different regulations in different countries become harder to navigate, or have countries become more unified in the way that they do business in the insurance world?
I would say a bit of both. So the countries that have good insurance traditions, of which I would honestly say Britain is probably the best. We can have a debate, which is not very interesting for this podcast, so let's not do it, but about the good and bad aspects of the regulation. But it kind of makes sense in that everybody understands, what is an insurance company, what is a broker, and what is an agent, and all that kind of thing. In other countries, there are certain categories, for example, that don't exist in the regulation, so that you get forced into some category with things that are nothing to do with insurance and then regulated or less regulated in a very strange way. So a great starting point, and I've actually written about this in various articles and things, would be if everyone kind of agreed on the basic taxonomy and definitions, and then, okay, maybe different countries regulate them in different ways. But even between the US and the UK, it's funny because agent in the UK means somebody who's basically an outsourced salesperson of an insurance company. In the US, they use that to mean a broker. And a broker is working on behalf of the client and dealing with multiple insurance companies. So you can see how quickly this can become quite confusing, even just in a conversation between two people.
Confusing enough when speaking with Americans and saying things like pavement, and we don't know what we're talking about. So let alone the specific things there. Leaning more into the conversation about insurance, I think there's a quote of yours that insurance is about everything. Could you share maybe something that our audience might not expect that people might insure? Maybe something around, I don't know, AI or cars or something.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. And actually, I stole that quote from a friend of mine who said it to me at a party, a friend from Norway. But if you think about it, in insurance, you are trying to pretty much insure anything that's like part of GDP, right? So any goods, any services in some way is going to be touched by insurance. So you have the obvious things that we all know about, insuring house, car, liability insurance for employers. But yes, you're right. There are all sorts of kind of new risks. So it could be a different take on an older risk. So, for example, driverless cars, as opposed to typical kind of motor insurance, where obviously you don't have to worry about who the driver is because there isn't one. And as you said, some of these new risks. So every time I see some kind of like new thing happening, I'm like, this is something where the insurance industry in the short term can lose money because there are going to be claims and maybe they weren't foreseeing that or they were unlikely, but the event happened. But on the other hand, it's a new opportunity. So all these new things, such as AI, cryptocurrencies, all this kind of stuff, cyber is already kind of getting going. But in the beginning, it's like, there's this new thing we hadn't really thought about. And the temptation is to exclude it from the policies, which is not necessarily super helpful to any of the parties. But then it becomes a new business line, right? And it's up to the insurance industry to kind of decide, how can this be insurable? And the good thing about this, and we're seeing it happening with cyber, and it's going to happen with AI, it's going to happen with crypto, is that in order to be able to buy insurance, you need to meet certain standards. And in some cases, the companies are actually dynamically kind of looking at what their clients are doing to help them before something really goes wrong. And the good thing about this is, well, you can get cover, but also it's really, really improving risk management. And that's one of the good things about insurance. It can improve risk management, and honestly, it can also be an early warning signal. If you can't get insurance, sorry folks in the California fires or floods in Florida, but I mean, there's a reason for that.
You're aligning incentives as well. So if you are making it possible to receive insurance or insure new goods, then businesses will strive to make sure that they qualify for that insurance, which would make them reach a broader market share. And so it could create a virtuous cycle. Is that correct?
Yes. So, I mean, I was on the board of a company that was actually doing business in Africa. And the board recommended to them that they should buy cyber insurance because at some point they were potentially looking to attract new investors. And it's usually important for the investors. And as you say, it's a kind of sign of kind of good corporate hygiene. And so that they were able to buy the insurance, but to do it, they had to go through a process of kind of like upgrading their cyber controls, better documentation, discussing with the underwriters and so on, which was actually, I think, a very healthy thing to do. So, and the same with preventative things, right? If in the insurance company says, well, you need to do this to get insurance, it actually can be a motivation for people to make their house more secure, or to drive better now, right? We have telematics that are kind of seeing what people are doing, and it's like, oh, I can save money if I don't do speeding and don't do hard braking and don't drive in the middle of the night or whatever it is. And so I think that's a good thing. It doesn't always work perfectly initially, but in the long run, I think that's a good thing.
You're known for spotting trends early. What's a key trend you've identified recently that companies aren't paying enough attention to yet?
Well, there's some less new ones and some newer ones. The two things I'd probably draw attention to, the first one, honestly, is climate change. Now, I know everyone's been talking about this for a while, and some companies are definitely paying attention to it. But I think it's become too politicized, and we need to kind of step back from that and look at what the real risks are. Because, for example, if you are lending money, and we'll go back to the things that are getting burned, the buildings that are getting burned in California or getting flooded or whatever in Florida, if you're lending money to people to buy houses or to commercial real estate or something, and it's going to end up getting destroyed, that is going to be, a bit of a problem. Similarly, if you're a bank lending to farming, to agriculture, if crops are getting destroyed, if they have to completely change what they're doing, or there are droughts or whatever, this is going to be a problem because they're not going to be able to repay the loans. So it's not a new topic, it's not a new risk, but I don't think it's really being thought about enough as to what is the real risk to businesses. The new one, which is kind of super new, I would say, is one I mentioned earlier, which is this whole thing in the broadest sense about crypto and blockchain and so on, because everyone thinks, oh, it's Bitcoin and what's that got to do with insurance? But in fact, a lot of these developments are going to have an impact on all sorts of other things. For example, we're already seeing these things called stable coins, which are cryptocurrencies that are linked to dollars, or it could be euros, could even be gold or something, being used for things like international payments. And all of us who've worked and traveled in different countries know that international payments are pretty painful. I was trying to transfer some money for myself from my bank account in England to my bank account in the US recently, and it was pretty awful in terms of the time it took, but also in terms of the amount, the frictional cost, right? And so there are great opportunities, particularly when you're moving between currencies where there's no market currently, for using things like stable coins. But it's also challenging the traditional kind of banking and foreign exchange markets, right, which are making a lot of money out of everyone kind of changing their currencies. So I think there are implications to all this far outside of people who want to buy Bitcoin. And as we just mentioned, there are opportunities for the insurance industry, potentially, for example, around custody of crypto assets, where there have been lots of hacks and kind of like bad things going on. So that's the one that I think is not being talked about that much, but is going to have a wider effect on a kind of larger number of sectors than people are thinking right now.
Sounds like the thread there is kind of understanding how things connect and how one thing might lead to another, and kind of how human beings behave. What would you say when you're looking for these trends, or when you're looking for what might happen? What is your biggest focus to be able to predict where things might go?
I think it's really thinking about different scenarios, because the whole point is we don't know. And I think people, including me, but also companies, can they have their thesis, right? And it's good to have a thesis. But when that thesis doesn't work out, if you haven't thought about, the famous plan B, C, D, or as I always say, plan Z, then you have a problem. So remember, all sorts of new things that everybody thought were crazy and wouldn't work out, like, I don't know, mobile phones or something, right? Now everyone has a mobile phone, but in the beginning, people, why do you need a mobile phone? It's awful. Plus they were bricks and they didn't work well, and all that kind of thing. So I think it's thinking about lots of different scenarios, and you're right. I like kind of joining the dots in different and seeing different patterns. And the fact is, it's a bit like those artwork things, right? You can join the dots in different ways. There's no one route. So some of the things I'm saying today will undoubtedly be proved to be wrong in a few years or even months' time. And then there are other considerations around all these things we're talking about, climate and driverless cars and AI and crypto and whatever it is, that we haven't thought about. So I think it's keeping an open mind and not just being stuck on one track.
You've experienced firsthand the value of flexibility, and your job transition between, say, Switzerland and London highlights this. How do you cultivate trust and flexibility across cultures as a leader?
So I've worked a lot in global teams and with people in different locations. In that context, there are kind of multiple dimensions to trust, right? Because you have, first of all, people come from different cultures and different backgrounds and so on, and have different views on trust and what it means. And then you have the practical standpoint that somebody's working when somebody else is asleep, right? And how do you know that they're working? And I think two things. It's about coming to a common understanding, right? Because where I've made mistakes, and I'm sure other people have as well, is when you kind of assume that somebody thinks the same thing as you, and you're not necessarily seeing it in the same way. So I do think, even with remote dispersed teams, it's good, if possible, to come together literally in the same room, if not to come together virtually, but to actually think about some of this stuff. And it's not just about different countries and different cultures, it's also different personality types. I'm a very extroverted person, and I've worked very successfully. In fact, probably some of my most successful collaborations have been with people in my team who were extremely introverted. But once we got to know each other and got to work well together, it was really great. So I think it's coming to a kind of shared understanding, but then you actually have to kind of live out the trust, right? It's no good saying, oh yeah, you're doing the work, but I'm gonna like check on you every 5 minutes. I think people need to, have autonomy and need to feel trusted. And there's a problem when managers, leaders, or companies kind of say one thing and do something else.
I think that's such a valuable thing to clarify and kind of clear the mist a little bit, because you're right, there's different cultures, different personality types, just different ways that we see the world. And it's quite surprising how we all get through a day, actually, when you consider that we're communicating with people all of the time and often having very different conversations than the other person and not realizing that. So I think that's a really great thing to clarify what that all means and come together on that common purpose.
I think it's a source of strength as well. So I should put in at this point that I've done some very interesting work for an organization I'm involved with, which is called the DCRO Institute. And it focuses on risk management expertise at board level. And one of the things they developed with a kind of personality testing company in the UK is something called the Risk Personality Compass, for use for management teams and corporate boards. And it's a bit like other personality tests that we might have all taken, like Myers-Briggs and so on, but specifically focused on attitude to risk, but not in terms of whether you like to take a lot of risk or not, although that's a little part of it, but how do you approach risk? What do you automatically think? Do you get excited? Do you, are you kind of terrified? Do you want to do loads and loads of analysis? This type of thing. And it's a really, I think, useful framework, because if you look at the group as a whole, you can see, like, do you have groupthink, which is obviously dangerous? Do you have kind of two opposing, two groups of people who are quite similar, but very different from each other? Do you have people all over the map, which is kind of great for diverse opinions, but maybe you like never decide anything, right? In that case, you need a really strong chair in the room. And it's much easier to discuss in the context of like this risk type compass than just to kind of say, oh, somebody's annoying, what are they doing? Why do they always say this? So I think those kind of tools as well can be really helpful. We did something when I worked at Swiss Re on personality types, and we had to go and stand around like in a circle where your personality type was. And I realized that there was somebody who I liked as a person, but found very difficult to work with, who was in the complete opposite, standing as opposite me on the circle. And it definitely gave me and him, I think, a greater understanding of exactly why we found it difficult to work together. So I think those kind of things are extremely helpful.
And I think more important, actually, if we're talking about global teams, than cultural differences, because you can have personality to, let's just take extrovert, introvert, an extrovert in the States or an extrovert in India probably will still get along with each other and work together quite similarly than if you had an introvert or an extrovert from either one of those places. So I'm very big into the personality types and understanding that. And I think it's key for leaders and for any teams to understand each other better. Also spouses, it works well there as well, I think.
You were deeply involved, Susan, in the aftermath of major global disruptions like 9/11 and the financial crisis. What lessons have you carried forward into navigating today's uncertainties with people talking about AI disruption and geopolitical volatility?
Well, I think the first thing is that you kind of realize that you can survive, as it were. So I was in a role in the global financial crisis that was quite demanding, and ended up working very long hours. It was very stressful, and at the time, it was really, really a lot to deal with it. And the truth is, there were aspects of it I didn't deal with very well because I was getting super stressed out. Having said that, it enabled me to work on some really interesting transactions, such as the capital injection that Warren Buffett's company Berkshire Hathaway did in Swiss Re, which came together really, really quickly, and was a successful transaction in a lot of regards. So after that, it is a classic. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? When you've seen a few of these things and you're like, I have no idea what's going on. It feels like the world's coming to an end, but somehow we get through it and come out the other side. You do kind of become calmer. I'm not naturally a very calm person, but in COVID, or kind of like even now with all the sort of geopolitical things that are going on, I'm like, I've seen not exactly the same thing, but at different crises before. As I say, even when I was applying for jobs at university, that there was a kind of a bit of a financial crisis going on. So I think that just having perspective helps. And the other thing that I would say is, during those kind of crisis periods, having the right people around you really helps. I mean, I have a massive, shout out to my boss at the time during the financial crisis, because it wasn't easy for any of us. But he was like really, really supportive, really appreciative, and all that kind of thing. And it makes a big difference. So when things are getting kind of messy, the human connection and just giving somebody a bit of support, there's no, you can't say how valuable that is.
You shared your experience of realizing a job was a great fit, but a country wasn't. What advice do you have for professionals confronting similar dilemmas, balancing career ambitions and personal well-being with their environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, because I learned from it. So when I went to work in Switzerland, I liked my job, I liked the company, but I really found it difficult to kind of integrate into the Swiss society. And I was lucky because the company was pretty enlightened for that period in terms of people working in different locations. And I actually kept the same job, and I went back to being based in London, although I ended up spending quite a lot of time in Switzerland and in other countries. Um, and I still think that Switzerland was not for me. But I learned from that, in that when I moved to the US, which was a different scenario, but I kind of really immersed myself up front in kind of living in the US. Now, in a way, that was easier because from the US to England, you can't just keep going home for the weekend, which you can from Switzerland. But just to take an example, when I was still in London, I subscribed to a newspaper. I was moving to Washington, D.C. I subscribed to the Washington Post, which is a DC local newspaper, before I left the UK. And I started reading it and things like that. And so I think just being prepared to kind of embed in the new place does help. One of the problems with me in Switzerland is I was kind of working there, but I still felt like I really lived in London, and I really wanted to be in London, and it was easy to go there all the time. So I think it kind of taught me a lesson. But I would advise anybody, um, going to work in another country, don't try to make it just like where you were before, right? Actually get into the local culture and find things to do and meet people, outside of work and that type of thing.
So when it comes to out of interest, so balancing personal desires with ambition and career, obviously they're very linked, and you can't really say it's one or the other. What would you say if somebody's choice was, I have this job in this place, but I don't like this place, or I don't have this job and I stay in a different place? Where would you say people need to find that inspiration to get the answer?
I'm biased because of what happened to me, and I was lucky, right? Because I was able to keep the job and do it in a different place. But I remember one of the hardest things was admitting to myself and then admitting to anybody else that, oh, maybe I've made a mistake, right? I don't like the place. I mean, it could be the opposite. You like the place and you don't like the job. And I remember I went to have lunch with somebody in London, and he was like, "How's it going?" And I was kind of like, "Well, I like the job, I don't like the place." And he said, "You should talk to them," because I just assumed, well, I'm going to have to leave, right? And he said, "You should talk to them about it." And I was like, "Oh, but they'll have a fit," because I mean, I'd taken the job in Switzerland, right? And I had Swiss contract, everything. And he said to me, "What's the downside risk? If nothing can be done about it, you'll just leave anyway, right? So what's the downside risk to you?" And I'm so glad he gave me that advice, because I plucked up my courage and I talked to my boss, and then he talked to the CEO and all the rest of it. So I think it's, you shouldn't just give up after kind of two weeks, but I think it is worth having the discussion, because in some cases you may be able to do the job somewhere else, or you may be able to move to a different job to be in the place that you want to be. But you also, to your point, you have to be prepared to walk away if that's really what you want to do, right? Otherwise people are going to be unhappy forever. But in many cases things are not binary, and they can find a solution. And obviously it depends on the company, but I think there is more openness to different ways of working, particularly since COVID, than there was before.
Agreed. So I want to pivot now, actually. So you co-led IFC's Women in Insurance initiative. So I'd like to understand a bit more. How does gender-focused financial programs reshape economic landscapes? And what do you think might be next for gender inclusion? Do you think we've kind of got to the end of the runway, or what's left to go?
So for the listeners who don't know, the IFC is International Finance Corporation, and it's the private sector arm of the World Bank. So what IFC does is make investments a bit like a private equity or venture capital investor in emerging markets. So I was in the financial services division. So we were dealing with insurance, banking, fintech, and so on. And for quite a while, they'd had a program for women, banking on women, I think it was called. And that was about working with banks to encourage women to actually open bank accounts in countries where that was often not very much the case. And it wasn't that they weren't allowed to, it was that in many cases the banks and what you had to do to open a bank account was not very friendly to women at all. And we had the same idea with insurance, because actually very often it's women who are kind of taking care of the household, who are thinking about like risks and what can go wrong, and so on, and tend to be perhaps more open to buying insurance than the men. But insurance, traditionally insurance products were developed a long time ago, and when families were very different from how they are now, and where the main people kind of doing transactions were men. And so you either had a situation where it just wasn't very friendly to women, maybe there were no women if they went into the insurance agency or whatever it is. Some of the policies didn't really cover the issues that women were facing. And for example, a lot of women have kind of businesses as like a side hustle or whatever, so their kind of business and their personal life is very entwined. And what happens with that? Is it personal insurance? Is it business? What's going on? So the idea was to work with insurance companies in developing countries to, yes, develop kind of products for women, but sometimes it wasn't even you needed to change the product. It was the way that it was explained, the way that it was marketed. And we did focus groups. It was based on human-centered design. So we did focus groups with women, not really, at least initially, asking them about insurance, but asking them what were the kind of risks and challenges in their daily lives. And then thinking a bit about, okay, are there insurance solutions to some of these things? And then, yes, asking them, about their perception of insurance or of different companies, brands, and so on. But as I say, it involved everything from the selling and the delivery, and things like having women in a call center, so when you phone up, you can speak to a woman, which is important in some cultures. So we did some interesting work. Sadly, I think there's still work to be done. And to be fair, it's not only about women. So to go back to what I said a minute ago, a lot of insurance products were developed a long time ago, and the insurance industry tends to be rather product focused. So here's the product and you should buy it, and if you don't, you're an idiot, kind of thing. And in reality, a lot of those insurance policies don't really reflect how people's lives are now. And I would think particularly about gig economy workers, and also, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, people who move between countries. So to give you a real life example, when I moved to the US, I was 49 years old, and I'd had a driving license since I was 17, which, as you know, is when you can get a driving license in England. But I was treated for motor insurance like I was a new driver who just passed my driving test. Well, clearly that wasn't true. And because I'd been to all these countries, I was actually perfectly okay to drive on the other side of the road. So it was pretty annoying and cost me a lot of money. So I think there are things that, the insurance companies need to really think about. What are people's lives like, and how can we kind of support that, as opposed to, just having this kind of like old suite of policies.
I feel your pain, Susan. I had to do the driving test in Japan, and for me, it was the opposite.
What side of the road do they drive on in Japan? Is it the same as the UK?
I think you would call it the correct side, Becky.
Right.
So, Susan, I'd like to pivot to board dynamics in disruptive times, and perhaps just board dynamics for people that aren't really clear on what value a board brings to their business. From your extensive board experience, what's the most critical role of a board during times of rapid technological change or economic instability, like we touched on? And I'm thinking also perhaps of the kind of fiasco that happened with OpenAI's board, and sometimes you see these disagreements between the CEO and the board. Can you just help us understand that relationship?
Sure. So boards of directors are there to, primarily safeguard the interests of the shareholders, right? Because that's the concept of setting up a company. But most people agree that they also, in order to do that, need to be looking out for other stakeholders as well, whether it's customers, employees, regulators, making sure you're not polluting the environment, local communities, and so on and so forth. So it's an important role because you're not running the company. And the thing that's most quoted about board members is nose in, fingers out. So what does that mean? It means ask good questions, take an interest, probe, don't get fobbed off with answers that you don't understand or seem superficial or whatever. But you don't, or certainly not, it's a little bit different in very early stage companies, but you're not there to do the work, because apart from anything else, if you're doing the work, then you're overseeing your own work. So it's like grading your own exams. Like, I was awesome. So boards have to kind of be careful with that. So you are exercising governance, oversight, all this kind of thing. So this brings up some kind of interesting dynamics. Firstly, there often can be like an asymmetry of information, because you would hope that the management knows more about the company, the day-to-day operations, than the board. But it's important that the board are acting independently. Now, depending on the ownership structure of the company, there may be some board members who are not independent. But one thing that's important is that board members are representing the shareholders as a whole. So even if you were appointed by one of the owners of the company or something, your role is to represent the shareholders as a whole. So it's important that board members are are adding value and not just kind of so you don't have 11 people or 9 people, however many it is, who are all the same, right? Which gets back to our things about personality type. So what does all the same mean? So I think boards function well when you have people with different backgrounds, different experience, different personality types, etc. But of course, that's a challenge, right? Because you're different and you're supposed to be different, but you have to kind of come together and ultimately kind of agree with the CEO and the management. Okay, this is the direction we're going to move in, and so on. So there's a difficult balance between kind of seeking consensus and what you might term a cop out, right? Because sometimes it's easy to avoid difficult topics, or people just like, oh, I don't really understand this, I'm not happy about it, but I'm just going to go along. On the other hand, it's very disruptive if and the same in management teams. If you've made a decision and then someone kind of backtracks on it, or, oh, I don't really want to do that, that's kind of like a nightmare. So I would say, everyone's talking about teams, right? And I had an interesting discussion with a friend who serves on several boards about, is the board a team? And we came to the conclusion that the best analogy was a chamber orchestra. And why is it a chamber orchestra? Well, it's not a huge orchestra, right? Because you're talking about, 9, 11, 13 people or something. You're not talking about the management team of a big company that could be 100, 200, 500. But you have people playing different instruments and playing different parts of the music, but ultimately it all has to come together and sound fantastic. And you can't have someone who decides to, bang the drum when they're not supposed to, right? So I think it is a pretty good analogy. And in this case, the chair of the board is kind of also like the conductor of the orchestra, although in this case, I guess it's a conductor who's playing an instrument as well.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. We covered a lot of ground talking about your varied experience, the times we live in, how they might connect and be somewhat cyclical, although I don't think it's exactly a retelling of what's happened before. If you could go back in time or give your younger self a single piece of advice based on all you've learned, what would it be?
This is actually going to sound a bit strange, maybe, but I think it would be, don't be afraid to take risks. Because when I have done that in terms of, I don't know, changing jobs or countries or getting involved with, new innovative areas, at the time, sometimes it was not easy, work out all this, that. But overall, I'm kind of, glad that I did it. So the one thing that I find, well, I say depressing, but when I talk to people early in their careers and they're trying to work out what to do, I always say, well, look, this is not your whole life you're signing away, right? We don't know what we're going to be doing in even 5 years' time, let alone 10. There are all these exactly disruptive elements that are going to play out. So kind of don't worry about it. Find something that you want to do for 2 or 3 years and then kind of see where that leads you. And, not by design, but I guess I did kind of do that. But there are other countries I wish I'd worked in, to be honest, that never happened, even though I visited them. So I'd say, don't be afraid of taking risks, and that, it's not like one decision is kind of locking you in for life.
Right. Well said. Is there anything that was left unsaid that you would like to highlight?
Maybe just one other thing which we did touch on, which is somebody asked me, what's the thing you're most proud of in my career? And this sounds really cheesy, but it's true. It's the people that work for me. If you stick around for long enough, you see people that you hired as, mid-career or even pretty junior people. I used to hire a lot of graduates straight out of university. I like those. And, when you see these people going on to be chief financial officers and CEOs and partners in large financial services firms and all this kind of thing, and that's really extremely gratifying and fantastic. And I always like to think, that hopefully I played a little role in that. And I've so enjoyed, staying in touch with people that I worked with like years and years ago. And even though we hardly ever see each other, occasionally something will pop up on LinkedIn or whatever. And I think that's kind of really nice. So never underestimate, well, first of all, how you can positively influence somebody else's life and career, and also like let's all celebrate each other.
I like that. We're all connected. Where can people follow you? Where would you like to point them?
Oh gosh. Well, I am, I guess, mainly on LinkedIn, and I tend to, if I write an article, if I do a podcast, I usually post it there. So, in terms of at least any kind of business related things, that's probably the best place.
Well, thank you for talking with us today, Susan. You've had an amazing career, and I can tell it's just getting started.